I remember the morning as one of those Oxford half-days when the air seems undecided between mist and rain, and the gravel paths of university parks take on a faint shimmer that makes everything appear slightly removed from itself. I had walked there without purpose, or perhaps with the only purpose left to a man who has grown accustomed to his own silences and an attempt to think of nothing at all. The river moved lazily, its surface blurred like breath on a mirror, and I felt an odd tug of nostalgia without knowing precisely for what. A fragment of Houseman drifted somewhere at the edge of my mind, but the wording kept slipping away, refusing to assemble itself correctly. There are mornings when even memory resists cooperation. A jogger passed me with the restless urgency of someone trying to outrace an inner truth, and for a while I watched him disappear into the fog. It was the small cry he gave less alarm than confusion that finally pulled me from my quiet. I saw him standing a little way ahead, peering down at the ground as though confronted with something he had no vocabulary for. I approached with the weary inevitability of a man who recognizes the beginning of a story before anyone else realizes one has started. On the grass lay a delicate locket made of pale, translucent glass, cracked through the center like frozen water struck by a stone. A faint smear of dried blood traced the metal clasp. It looked absurdly fragile, as though it had been waiting for the slightest disturbance to shatter. The jogger muttered something about not wanting to get involved, and he left me with the object as though I were its natural custodian. That morning light, still caught in the fog, made the locket glow faintly. I slipped it into my coat pocket, and for reasons I couldn't articulate, I felt a strange reluctance to close the button over it. A park warden ambled over, his steps slow, his expression containing more irritation than concern. "Lost jewelry," he suggested. "Students becoming careless again." I said nothing. I'd learned long ago that the smallest discoveries often conceal the sharpest edges. We walked together to the nearby bench, where the warden pointed out a slight disturbance in the damp leaves. Something had pressed there recently, something heavier than the locket itself. He talked about bicycles abandoned overnight and lovers' quarrels at ungodly hours. I listened, though not to him. In the distance, I heard the indistinct murmur of 2 security officers approaching, their radios crackling with static. One of them mentioned, almost idly, that a woman from Lady Margaret Hall had been reported missing since late the previous evening. It was said with the casual professionalism of someone who has not yet allowed fear to infiltrate the official tone. I looked down at the broken locket and felt the fog thicken around me. Lewis would later tell me that I seemed unusually subdued when he finally caught up with me, but in truth I was simply measuring the quiet. There is a moment just before a case reveals its shape, when the world feels delicately balanced, like ink settling on the surface of still water. Lewis spoke about breakfast, about the unpredictability of Oxford traffic, about something strange had barked at him earlier. I barely heard him. My thoughts kept circling the small injury to the clasp, the dried smear of blood, and the way the glass had cracked with such precision as though the blow had been neither accidental nor entirely deliberate. We walked back along the path, the fog beginning to lift in thin, reluctant strands. I found myself glancing repeatedly at the bench, at the indentation of leaves, at the faint scuff on the gravel that curved slightly to the right. A single clean mark among otherwise natural disarray. It reminded me of something, though I couldn't yet place what. Perhaps a crossword clue half formed at the back of my mind. Shattered truth, 7 letters. The thought came and went before I could grasp it. As we reached the park gate, I felt the weight of the locket shift in my pocket. I paused, listening to the distant toll of a bell from one of the colleges measured melancholy, exact. I had heard such bells all my life, yet somehow this one felt less like a summons and more like a warning, as though the city itself were drawing a boundary I was about to cross. Lewis asked if I was all right, and I told him I was fine, though even then I knew it wasn't true. What I did know, with the unmistakable certainty that arrives before evidence has any right to justify it, was that the locket had not been dropped innocently. Something had broken here, something fragile, perhaps even hopeful, and whatever story had begun in the fog was already moving towards its darker destination. I've often wondered whether I sensed the ending even then, or whether some part of me simply recognized the shape of sorrow long before it had a name. The morning offered no answers, only the quiet insistence that nothing found near a river in Oxford is ever just what it appears to be. I've often thought that there is a particular kind of stillness found only in Oxford rooms inhabited by those who are no longer present, a mixture of lingering intention and abruptly halted breath. When Lewis and I stepped into her set of rooms at Lady Margaret Hall that morning, I felt it at once the unmistakable quiet of a life paused in mid-sentence. The curtains were half-drawn, letting in a sliver of pale light that touched the edge of a desk scattered with notes, books, and a single crossword left conspicuously unfinished. There was something faintly unsettling in the neatness of it all. Not order, exactly, but the careful habits of a mind accustomed to structure, suddenly disrupted. Lewis moved first, his steps cautious, as if afraid to disturb whatever had been left behind. I stood by the doorway for a moment longer, letting my eyes adjust to the thin light and the memory of rain, tapping faintly on the old sash window. It struck me that the room smelled of paper and lavender, an oddly fragile combination, the sort favored by women who read too carefully and trust too rarely. I brushed my fingers against the spine of a book on her desk. The Oxford Book of English Verse, heavily annotated. Most of the marginalia was written in a small, precise hand. One line, however, had been corrected twice. A misquotation. I felt an involuntary tightening of thought. Her tutor arrived with that brittle, well-mannered efficiency one sees too often in academia. She greeted us with the politeness of someone who resents our presence and hopes we will notice. Her voice trembled only when she mentioned the missing student's name, though whether from worry or the fear of implication was difficult to determine. She insisted the young woman had been brilliant, conscientious, and admired. I have learned over the years that such praise is almost always defensive. Admiration in colleges tends to be rationed with the same caution as departmental budgets. Lewis asked about the girls' relationships. The tutor hesitated just enough to reveal that there had been complications. A colleague, she finally said. Someone who had taken too strong an interest in her recent research. A doctoral student with a reputation for charm that evaporated under scrutiny. Something in the tutor's tone made me glance again at the crossword. Only one clue remained blank. 7 letters. A pattern emerged even before any facts aligned. We examined the wastebasket next. A crumpled note lay inside, written in hurried, agitated strokes. You misquoted him again. Meet me where the river bends. The phrasing lodged itself somewhere uncomfortably between accusation and intimacy. I read it twice, then a third time, noticing the pressure of the pen at the final word. A person angry enough to demand a meeting, but not angry enough to reveal themselves fully. Academic quarrels often masquerade as romantic ones, though the reverse is equally true. I explored the rest of the room with the deliberate slowness of someone searching for a conversation rather than an object. On the bedside table sat a wine-glass, the last remnants dried to a faint crimson outline. A second glass had been washed, but left upside down beside the sink, as though she had expected company or, perhaps, had hoped for company and been disappointed. The notion of disappointment clung to the room like dust. I felt it in the book stacked too neatly, in the careful overlay of lecture notes, in the way a scarf had been folded, then abandoned across the armchair. Lewis mentioned that the porter had seen her return late the previous evening, alone, moving quickly, head lowered. A woman in haste is rarely a woman unworried. I stood near the window and looked out across the garden quadrangle. where a few students crossed with the purposeful aimlessness of youth. Somewhere in the distance, a bell struck the quarter hour. The sound traveled cleanly across the damp air, unsettling in its clarity. I found myself imagining her last steps through the college gate, the thoughts she might have carried, the weight of whatever truth she had intended to confront at the river bend. Something about the room nagged at me. It was only when I returned to the desk that I realized what it was. The chair was angled slightly away, not pulled in neatly as one might expect. She had left it in haste. A small detail, meaningless to most, but rarely insignificant. A person preparing to meet someone does not leave a chair askew unless pulled abruptly by something unresolved. Lewis asked what I made of it all. I told him the room felt like an apology left unfinished. He frowned at that, understandably, but I could not shake the impression. Absence has a particular shape, and hers filled the room more fully than any presence could have. When we finally stepped outside into the faint brightness of the quadrangle, I felt the air shift. Not a revelation, merely the first subtle confirmation that something in her life had cracked long before the Locket ever did. I've always believed that Oxford reveals its truest face at dusk, when the colors drain from the day and the stone begins to speak in its older, quieter voice. It was during such an hour that Lewis and I returned to University Parks, to question the groundskeeper once more, the man who claimed to have seen someone lingering near the gates the previous evening. The air held the faint chill of approaching rain, and the lamps along the path flickered with a weary determination. I found myself listening not to Lewis's words, but to the subdued rustle of leaves above us, a sound that echoed the uncertainty gathering around the case. The groundskeeper met us with a guarded politeness. He described the figure he had seen tall, well-dressed, and moving with a manner so deliberate it seemed rehearsed. I asked him to recall anything unusual. He hesitated before mentioning the way the man had paused at the gate, as though expecting someone to appear from the mist. There was an oddity in the description, something too measured to be mere memory. I asked whether the man had spoken. Only a single word, he said, carried away by the wind before he could discern it. We walked with him to the gate. The light was thinning, drawing long shadows across the path. I noticed a cigarette stub in the gravel, an imported brand, rarely sold locally. The groundskeeper insisted it had not been there that morning. I crouched to examine it, feeling that tightening of thought that comes when a detail refuses to align. Someone had come here with intention, not curiosity. Lewis suggested it might belong to the postgraduate student, but I dismissed the idea. As we continued, a man approached from the direction of the sports fields. He carried himself with the unhurried grace of someone accustomed to careful self-presentation. He introduced himself as a researcher who often walked at dusk to clear his thoughts. There was something in his voice, a faint tremor delicately concealed, that stirred my suspicion. He spoke of the missing woman with a gentle reverence that felt curated. I asked whether he had seen anyone unusual. He paused a moment before admitting he might have glimpsed a figure near the trees. The hesitation mattered. Lewis engaged him while I studied the man's shoes, damp around the edges, but bearing a faint trace of river silt, not park soil. A simple observation, yet it lodged itself into my unease. He noticed my gaze and shifted slightly, aware of what the detail betrayed. He excused himself soon after, claiming an appointment, leaving behind the faint scent of tobacco, similar to the stub in my hand. On the walk back, Lewis mentioned that the postgraduate student had spoken defensively about the missing woman, his jealousy poorly veiled beneath academic courtesy. I listened, though my mind lingered on the man at dusk, the way he measured each word. People reveal themselves not through what they say, but through the caution applied to their speech. Something about him, the silt on his shoes. The controlled voice told me he carried a truth he had not yet chosen to surrender. The park seemed to hold its breath, as though coming night carried something it preferred to keep hidden. Even Lewis paused in his usually steady commentary, perhaps sensing the same pull of unease that threaded itself through the air. Moments like that often linger with me longer than facts. The groundskeeper's stiffness suggested he feared he had noticed more than he wished to acknowledge. Such reluctance can be more telling than certainty. As we walked on, I felt the first stirrings of intuition, the impression that the figure he described had not been wandering, but waiting for something that never came. That evening, it was Lewis who received the call, though the tremor in his voice when he handed me the phone suggested he already feared what it would confirm. A body had been found along the backwater, caught among the reeds where the river slackened into a kind of reluctant stillness. I felt a slow heaviness settle over me, the sort that arrives not with shock but with recognition. One always hopes the missing have merely wandered away from their lives for a moment of privacy. But Oxford, for all its loveliness, has a talent for drawing tragedy into its quieter corners. The morning had not yet cleared. Faint rain drifted across the air like unformed thoughts. By the time we reached the river path, the college porter and 2 constables stood in somber formation near the bank. They parted as we approached, revealing the young woman's body lying half-turned, as though she had been gently placed there rather than claimed by the current. Her hair fanned outward, darkened by water, and her coat clung to her shape with an unsettling, almost domestic intimacy. For a moment, I could not help but think she looked as though she had simply bowed her head to listen to something only she could hear. Lewis murmured that there were no signs of struggle. I nodded, though not in agreement, more in acknowledgement of the incomplete truth. The medical examiner crouched beside the body, his expression carefully neutral. He pointed out a faint bruise just behind her ear, easy to miss unless one knew where to look. "Something small," he said. "Perhaps a fall." I watched his hands move with the calmness of routine and wondered how many times he had reassured himself with the word perhaps. A patrol officer held up a piece of glass they had found tangled in her coat. I took it, turning it carefully between my fingers. It matched the locket, not just in material, but in the way a fracture line curved like the memory of an old wound. I felt the same tightening in my mind that I had felt in her room, the sense that everything pointed inward to a truth she had not lived long enough to voice. Lewis asked whether I believed she had been pushed. I told him I believed she had not come here by accident, and sometimes that was the deeper wound. He frowned, not at my answer, but at its elusiveness. He has always preferred clarity, whereas I have spent most of my life discovering that clarity often lies to us more efficiently than confusion. We followed the river bank, searching for any imprint or disturbance. Rain-softened earth leaves little evidence, yet a solitary scuff near the bend caught my attention. Not deep enough for a struggle, but too sharply defined to be a casual step. Someone had paused here, perhaps waiting, perhaps hesitating. I traced the outline with a kind of reluctant reverence. A meeting of some kind had occurred, one that had unraveled as quietly as breath. A fisherman approached, his boots leaving clumsy patterns in the mud. He told us he had heard voices the previous night. A woman's tone, anxious but not panicked, and a man's, calmer, measured, as though trying to persuade. He could not make out the words. I asked him whether he had seen movement. "Only shadows," he said, shifting near the water. The admission lingered with an odd weight. Shadows in Oxford often carry more truth than the people who cast them. Back at the river's edge, I studied her face. There was something almost serene about her expression, but serenity can be a lie born of resignation. The bruise behind her ear suggested impacting a blow not intended to kill, but delivered with enough force to steal her balance near a treacherous bank. A moment of sharp anger, perhaps, or fear. The distinction matters little when the outcome converges. Lewis handed me her handbag, recovered downstream. Inside were the usual fragments of a young academic life. A folded timetable, a library card, a train ticket stub. but it was the small notebook that drew my attention. Waterlogged pages blurred most of the ink into delicate blue veins, except for a single line written in firmer pressure. He won't let me say it. I closed the notebook gently, struck by the quiet despair of the wording. Not fear, constraint. As we prepared to leave, the wind shifted, carrying the murmuring sound of the river against the reeds. It reminded me of something I couldn't place, some half-remembered phrase about truth lying beneath the surface of seemingly placid water. I watched her body once more before they covered it. The Locket's broken glass pressed cold against my palm, and for the first time that day I felt the unmistakable pull of a story beginning to reveal its deeper fracture. Something had broken here long before she slipped beneath the current. I have learned over far too many years that the dead often speak most clearly through the objects they leave behind. And so, on the afternoon after her body was pulled from the backwater, I found myself seated in the dim hush of the college library, turning the pages of her fellowship manuscript with the uneasy concentration of someone searching for a voice that no longer had the luxury of correcting itself. The rain had begun again, tapping at the old leaded windows in a rhythm that seemed almost deliberate, as though Oxford insisted upon providing its own accompaniment to my thoughts. Lewis stood nearby, pretending to understand the academic jargon scattered across the pages. He pointed at a paragraph about pastoral elegy and asked whether it meant anything useful. I told him it meant exactly what it always means in these colleges. Someone trying to say something honest while burying the truth beneath too many words. What struck me more than the content was the inconsistency. A quotation attributed to a poet I knew far too well was wrong by a single, telling word. I read it again, then again, feeling that familiar shift inside myself, the recognition that a small error often hides a larger intention. I requested the archived version of her submission. The librarian, a woman whose expression suggested she had seen every variety of academic vanity, brought it to me with the faintest sigh. The older draft differed in subtle but deliberate ways. A key argument softened here, a reference sharpened there. And that misquoted poet, the line had been correct in the first version. Someone had changed it later. Not carelessly, but cunningly. A person who understood that the slightest alteration can cast doubt on competence. Lewis said it might be a simple revision. I shook my head. Writers revise to clarify themselves, not to weaken the foundation of their own thought. The shift was too purposeful, too quiet in its sabotage. It reminded me of a crossword setter who hides the true clue beneath one that appears innocently straightforward. And as I traced the handwritten annotations in the margins, I noticed a difference in pressure. Some lines pressed lightly, others with a force that suggested intrusion rather than authorship. A second hand, disguised yet imperfectly so. We visited her tutor next. She received us in a cramped office smelling of damp paper and stale tea. Her eyes flitted over my face with careful composure as I mentioned the discrepancies in the manuscript. She claimed ignorance, though her voice tightened when I referenced the misquotation. She insisted the young woman had been under stress, perhaps careless. I remained silent long enough for the truth to twitch uneasily in the air between us. She avoided my gaze and spoke instead of deadlines, of her pressure, of the cruel competitiveness of young scholars. None of it rang true, or rather, all of it rang too conveniently. Lewis asked about the postgraduate student, the one whose interest in her work had apparently crossed professional boundaries. The tutor's discomfort sharpened at his name. She claimed he had been supportive, perhaps too supportive, though she stopped just short of admitting any impropriety. I watched her hands as she spoke, nervous, restless, rearranging papers that did not require rearranging. Guilt reveals itself in gestures long before words concede. Back outside, the quadrangle glistened with recent rain. Students moved across it with that purposeful disarray unique to academic life. I found myself thinking of the altered manuscript again. Why would someone undermine her work? Not jealousy alone. Something older. Something tied to pride or fear of being exposed by a mind more incisive than expected. We met the postgraduate researcher in a corridor lined with portraits of long-dead academics, their painted eyes filled with the quiet arrogance of men who never doubted their own brilliance. He spoke of the young woman with a tenderness that felt rehearsed. When I asked about her paper, he claimed to have offered only minor suggestions, yet his gaze slid away when I mentioned the misquotation. A small movement, but unmistakably defensive. I noticed a faint ink stain on his cuff, the same shade as the annotation in the altered draft. Coincidence, perhaps, yet my instinct whispered otherwise. As Lewis and I walked back along the cloister, I felt the weight of something forming just beyond clarity. Not a solution, merely the outline of betrayal. A person had tampered with her words, bending them gently out of shape until they no longer spoke cleanly. The manuscript lay in my hand like a confession written in two voices, and somewhere within those pages a fracture waited to reveal itself. There are moments in an investigation when an object appears so quietly, so innocently, that one almost overlooks it. And yet it is precisely such objects that cling longest to the mind. The photograph arrived in my hands that afternoon without ceremony, slipped from an envelope among the young woman's personal effects returned from the college porter. A simple thing glossy, slightly faded at the edges, the kind handed out at formal dinners with the promise of communal memory. But even before I studied the faces, I felt the familiar stirring of unease and intuition that something within it had survived while the person concerned had not. Lewis remarked that it looked ordinary enough. A dining hall filled with candles, students clustered in their evening dress, smiling with that guarded exuberance of people who believe themselves at the beginning of something meaningful. I scanned the front row and found her easily younger, perhaps less confident, though her expression held a warmth missing from the rooms we had searched. She was seated beside a man whose gaze lingered too intently in her direction. His face seemed familiar, though it took me a moment to place him. A senior fellow, now graying, known more for his charm at conferences than for any intellectual brilliance. I had spoken to him 2 days earlier and noted his studied composure. But here, in this captured moment from a decade past, his expression betrayed something softer, almost tender, and far more dangerous for its restraint. Lewis asked if I thought the connection meant anything. I told him connections always meant something. The question was merely how long they chose to hide. I held the photograph beneath the lamplight and looked again, this time at the margins. There, a faint inscription in the lower corner caught my attention. Someone had written a date, followed by 2 initials. Hers were not among them. Instead, the initials belonged to the senior fellow. A private notation, perhaps. A reminder of a night he wished to remember differently than she did. We took the photograph to the librarian who had assisted us earlier. Her eyes narrowed when she saw it, suggesting recognition she quickly attempted to suppress. She claimed the image was part of an old college archive and must have been misplaced among the students' belongings. I thanked her, though my gratitude was hollow. Her discomfort spoke far more loudly than her explanation. People rarely fear what is irrelevant. As we left, the air in the hallway felt stale, as though secrets had collected in its corners over too many years. I paused beside a bookshelf and considered the photograph again. The arrangement of the group seemed unremarkable, yet my eye kept returning to a gap between 2 figures near the back. A missing presence, perhaps, or merely the mind's insistence on symmetry. Still, the absence tugged at me. In crimes like this, what is missing often speaks louder than what remains. Lewis suggested we visit the senior fellow once more. His rooms were immaculate to the point of sterility. Books arranged with almost painful precision. Papers stacked so neatly they seemed more decorative than functional. He welcomed us with a politeness that felt rehearsed, though his eyes darkened slightly when I placed the photograph on his desk. He studied it too long before answering my questions, choosing each word as though fearing a misstep would expose something he had spent years burying. He claimed not to recall the evening in detail, a convenient lapse. Yet when I asked about the relationship between himself and the young woman, he stiffened. He described her as promising, reserved, and brilliant. The careful cadence of his speech reminded me of someone navigating a fragile truth without admitting its shape. His hands remained perfectly still, except for the smallest tremor in his left thumb, a detail I doubted he realized he revealed. When the conversation ended, I found myself reluctant to leave. There was something unfinished in that room, something unspoken lingering between old admiration and concealed regret. As we stepped into the fading light of the courtyard, Lewis remarked that the man seemed sincere. I told him sincerity was often the most useful disguise. Later that night, alone in my flat, I placed the photograph beneath the desk lamp and studied it again. I traced each face as though hoping for confession. It was then I noticed the reflection in a wineglass near the edge of the frame, a blurred silhouette standing apart from the group, unacknowledged by any of them. A presence uninvited, yet undeniably there. And for reasons I could not yet articulate, that shadowed outline unsettled me far more than any smiling face in the hall. There is a loneliness to the river bend at night that seems almost deliberate, as if the city itself withdraws from the water's edge out of respect for whatever confessions the current chooses to keep. When Lewis and I returned there the evening after the photograph surfaced, the air had that faint metallic smell of wet leaves underfoot, and the sky carried the bruised tint of gathering storm. I remember thinking how easily Oxford could disguise sorrow beneath its beauty, and how often I had allowed it to do so for me. The path curved gently, following the bend, and the reeds whispered with the slightest shift of wind. It felt like a place where silence knew far more than we did. Lewis walked slightly ahead, his torch beam sweeping across the mud with the earnestness of someone hoping for revelation. I moved more slowly. The ground preserved faint impressions from the previous night. Nothing precise, only the fragile suggestion of hurried steps and a heavier footprint near the water's edge. I knelt to examine one of them, noticing how the heel sank deeper than the rest, as though the person had paused, uncertain, or perhaps bracing themselves for an encounter. Uncertainty has its own weight. A witness had reported seeing the postgraduate student here around midnight, pacing and muttering while glancing repeatedly toward the trees. We found him easily enough later that afternoon, and he admitted to the meeting with a defensiveness that betrayed more than his words. He claimed she had simply not arrived. He said he waited, grew cold, then left. But the tremor in his voice told me the truth was more serrated. People often fear not the lie itself, but what the lie reveals about their longing. Lewis asked whether I believed him. I told him belief is a luxury investigators cannot afford, though doubt in its quieter way can be far more illuminating. I thought of the ink stain on the student's cuff, the hesitation in his eyes when I mentioned the altered manuscript, and the unmistakable tenderness in his voice whenever he spoke her name. If he was lying, it was not to conceal violence, but vulnerability. And vulnerability, in such cases, can create its own form of danger. We walked further along the path until the river widened slightly, catching what remained of the fading light. There, I noticed a small indentation in the mud, distinct from the others. A woman's footprint was lighter, narrower, and angled away from the path. The direction mattered. She had stepped off willingly, not forced. The impression was still crisp enough to contradict the suggestion of a struggle, and I felt a cold certainty ripple through me. She had come to meet someone, not flee them. Lewis crouched beside me and muttered that the senior fellow's alibi had begun to unravel. CCTV placed him near the park's entrance around the same time the postgraduate student claimed he was alone by the river. It was a revelation meant to reassure, but the neatness of it troubled me. When evidence aligns too conveniently, it often signals design rather than truth. I told Lewis as much, earning a skeptical frown. He called it intuition. I preferred to think of it as experience, the kind earned only by watching too many tidy lies collapse beneath the weight of an overlooked detail. A moor hen darted across the water, leaving behind a trembling line of ripples that distorted the river's reflection. I found myself staring at that shifting pattern, imagining her last moments here. The words she might have rehearsed, the fear she might have swallowed, the hope that the confrontation ahead would grant her clarity or closure. People rarely go to secret meetings seeking danger, they go seeking answers. We found no further physical evidence, only the deepening quiet that collects in places touched by sorrow. As we turned back toward the college lights, faintly visible through the trees, I felt a heaviness settle on my breath. The wind shifted, and the reeds rustled with a note of warning that seemed almost sentient. The river bend had witnessed something, but like all good observers, it kept its story buried in silt and shadow. Back on the footpath, Lewis asked what I made of the postgraduate student's pacing. I told him pacing is the body's way of arguing with the mind, and that whatever he had expected from her, it had not been absent. The senior fellow, on the other hand, had offered us only polite restraint, too polished, perhaps. But I could not yet decide which man's truth had bent the river's narrative out of its natural shape. When we finally left the bend behind, the first drops of rain began to fall soft, tentative, like the opening notes of a decision the night had not yet made. And as I listened to them settle into the earth, I felt the faintest tug of a thought forming that the river had not taken her. Something far quieter had. There is a peculiar comfort in believing one has solved a case, even when the mind knows better than to trust the sensation. It arrives like the warmth of a glass of whiskey on an empty stomach, immediate, persuasive, and entirely misleading. That morning, as Lewis laid out his argument with an earnestness bordering on triumph, I felt the edges of that false warmth begin to gather around us. The postgraduate student, he insisted, was the only one whose movements, temperament, and motives aligned with the evidence. I listened, not because I believed him, but because I wanted to understand the architecture of his certainty. We sat in one of the smaller interview rooms at the station, its walls bearing that faint antiseptic smell that clings to places where truth is negotiated rather than discovered. The student sat opposite us, his hands clasped too tightly, his eyes hollow with the exhaustion of someone who has not slept since the night by the river. He spoke with the strained sincerity of a man trying desperately to arrange his words into innocence. He admitted he had waited for her, that he had hoped to persuade her not to submit a revised manuscript he believed weakened her argument. He confessed his jealousy of her brilliance, though he wrapped it delicately in academic language. Lewis seized upon this with the enthusiasm of a man seeing a pattern he had long suspected. The student said he had left the river bend when the cold became unbearable. His voice wavered only when I asked whether he had seen anyone else. He paused, then shook his head too quickly. I watched his fingers, then the faint ink still staining the cuff from the annotations I had noticed earlier. The gesture struck me as significant, though I could not yet articulate why. A clue, perhaps, but without context, clues can be treacherous. Lewis leaned back, satisfied. The bruise behind the young woman's ear could have been the result of a heated argument, he suggested. A push, a slip, an accident exacerbated by jealousy. The student's pacing at the river, his agitation, his evasive pauses all pointed in one direction. I could feel the narrative forming around us, a story so coherent it risked becoming persuasive through its own structural neatness. And yet, as I listened, I felt an old ache tighten in my chest, the ache of instinct resisting conclusion. We left the student in the room and walked the corridor. the floorboards creaking beneath each step like the quiet protest of an old building overhearing an argument. Lewis said he thought we had it. I told him cases that resolve too smoothly are often cases where the truth has absented itself out of embarrassment. He smiled in that patient way of his, indulging what he calls my pessimism. I prefer to think of it as accuracy honed by disappointment. Back at the college, we visited her tutor again. She greeted us with a defensiveness, so subtle it appeared as concern. She spoke of the student's temper, his romantic fixation, his inability to accept intellectual rivalry. Each remark felt rehearsed. I asked whether she had ever seen him disagree with the young woman in a way that suggested danger. She hesitated just a fraction too long before saying no. That hesitation, the mind's smallest betrayal, flickered through me like a half-remembered clue from a crossword that refuses completion until seen from the right angle. Her office smelled of rain-dampened stone, and the weak light filtering through the window gilded the dust on her bookshelves. I noticed, on the desk, a set of draft students' work marked in neat, firm handwriting. The same handwriting, I suspected, had appeared in the altered manuscript. She saw my eyes fall upon them and swiftly rearranged the stack with a gesture too deliberate to be casual. Another tremor in the narrative. On the way out, Lewis remarked again upon the convenience of the student's explanation. His jealousy provided a motive. His solitary presence at the river provided opportunity. The bruise and the broken locket provided physical context. I nodded, though without conviction. Convenience in Oxford is rarely innocent. Later, alone in my office, I spread the manuscript drafts across the desk. The misquotation returned to the substitution of a single word. I murmured the original line under my breath and felt its cadence settle like a stone in still water. The altered version lacked weight, intention, precision. It was not the student's style. His annotations showed passion, even clumsiness. This change, by contrast, bore restraint. Restraint is a hallmark of someone accustomed to authority. The student's theory of unintended harm, fueled by frustrated desire, was almost plausible. Almost, but the river does not deceive, and neither does the subtle pressure of ink in a margin. As I sat in the dim pool of lamplight, the manuscript fragments whispering their fractured truth, I realized the warmth of certainty had vanished. What remained was the cool, clean recognition of error. The first solution had collapsed, and with it, so had the comfort of believing we were anywhere close to the end. There is a particular kind of disappointment that arrives only when one believes, however briefly, that clarity has been achieved. It is quieter than frustration and far more enduring. I felt it settling over me the morning we returned to speak with the senior fellow, armed with what Lewis believed to be the final pieces of the puzzle. A man with a concealed past, a shifting alibi, and a tenderness in an old photograph he had tried very hard not to acknowledge on the surface. It made him an elegant suspect, and elegance can be dangerously persuasive. But I have learned that elegance in crime is almost always accidental. We found him in his room, standing near the window as if hoping to be mistaken for someone in deep contemplation. The rain streaked softly down the glass, blurring the spires beyond into somnolent shapes. His voice carried a calm resignation when he greeted us. I placed the photograph on the table between us, the candles from that Longago College dinner flickering in arrested brightness. He stared at it with an expression that hovered between longing and regret. Lewis pressed him gently, guiding him through questions of affection, mentorship, boundaries crossed or merely imagined. The fellow spoke slowly, but not evasively. His affection, he admitted, had once exceeded propriety, yet never crossed into behavior he deemed unforgivable. Years had passed, and whatever had existed between them had faded into the polite distance academia demands of its own ghosts. Lewis then turned to the matter of the night she died. The fellow repeated his alibi, though with less certainty than before. He had claimed to be attending a departmental gathering, but new evidence placed him near the park's entrance. When confronted, he did not deny it. He explained that he had left the event early after a stifling wave of dizziness, an ailment he dismissed as exhaustion. He needed air. I needed space. I needed solitude. His voice trembled faintly as he said it, a tremor almost too delicate to catch. Lewis saw guilt. I saw something adjacent to guilt, but not synonymous with it. When he stepped out briefly to fetch a document he believed relevant, his wife appeared in the doorway with a calmness I found both admirable and unsettling. She carried the fatigue of someone whose life had been shaped by another's ambitions. She asked whether her husband was in serious trouble. Her tone held neither accusation nor fear, only a heaviness cultivated by too many years of fragile equilibrium. I told her we were gathering information. She nodded with an expression that suggested she already understood more than we had said. And then she told us something that shifted the entire conversation. 10 years earlier, she said, her husband had suffered a loss. He never fully emerged from a child stillborn after complications neither of them had spoken of since. The grief had split them quietly, invisibly, leaving behind a marriage held together by shared silence rather than partnership. That evening, when he left the departmental gathering, he had gone not to the river bend, but to the chapel, a place he visited on difficult anniversaries. She did not offer this as an excuse, only as an explanation, and I believed her. When the fellow returned, his composure cracked slightly upon seeing her. He admitted the truth with the shame of someone who believes his grief unworthy of acknowledgement. He had lied, but not to conceal crime, rather to protect a private sorrow. Lewis, though sympathetic, could not ignore the contradiction between this confession and his earlier account. But grief, unlike guilt, rarely constructs timelines with precision. This inconsistency was human, not criminal. We thanked them both and left. Outside, the rain had thickened into a steady murmur that softened the edges of the quadrangle. Lewis spoke of emotive jealousy, old affection, academic rivalry. He insisted the senior fellow still fit the pattern. I told him patterns are like shadows. They reveal shape, not substance. And this man's shadow did not match the contours of violence. Back at my office, I laid the photograph beside the manuscript and stared at the two artifacts of her life. The fellow's expression in that captured moment spoke of admiration, perhaps love, but not possession. He was liberated, though it had the ring of human frailty rather than design. The more I examined the trail we had constructed around him, the more unstable it became. Too many assumptions, too much emotional inference disguised as evidence. Then my eye caught the crossword she had left unfinished in her room. One clue is still blank. Shattered truth, 7 letters. I murmured possible answers, letting each roll across my mind like stones in a river. It was then the realization came not as revelation, but as correction. The clue was not metaphorical, it was literal. The locket had once held something small, folded, delicate, missing. Our second solution crumbled with one simple acknowledgement we had been looking at the wrong absence, and in that moment the investigation shifted, quietly but irrevocably, toward the person who had tried hardest to appear peripheral. There are murders committed with fury, with panic, with desperation. And then there are murders so quiet they seem almost like an afterthought of fate, barely more than a single moment of human weakness made permanent. By the time I understood which kind we were dealing with, the city had already pulled its evening cloak over the colleges, and the last of the light slipped across the old stone staircases like a farewell no one had the courage to speak aloud. I remember sitting in my office, the locket on the desk beside me, its fractured glass catching the lamplight in a way that felt almost accusatory. Something was missing from it, something small enough to fold twice, perhaps 3 times, and still fit beneath the clasp. A page torn out, a confession perhaps, or a threat. I could feel the truth circling closer, like a hesitant guest approaching a door they fear to knock upon. Lewis entered with his usual mixture of caution and persistence. He said the tutor had been asking about the progress of the case. Too eagerly, he added. Too frequently. I asked him whether he remembered the faint tremor in her hand when we had discussed the altered manuscript. He did. It hovered now in my memory, subtle yet insistent. A gesture born not from grief or anxiety, but from guilt that had not yet learned how to hide itself properly. Gesture often betrays intention long before words admit anything. We walked together to her college rooms, which were tucked away in one of the quieter cloisters, where even the footsteps of students seemed subdued by some unspoken rule of decorum. The corridor smelled faintly of chalk dust and recent rain, a mixture I had come to associate with intellectual pretense. She received us with polished courtesy, though her eyes moved too nervously between us. I placed the locket on her desk. She stared at it longer than necessary. I watched the muscles in her jaw tighten, a small betrayal she attempted to smother beneath academic poise. I asked about the manuscript again, this time not with curiosity, but with the calm weight of inevitability. She insisted she had merely offered suggestions, nothing more. But I noticed the folder at the edge of her desk, its binding warped slightly from having recently come into contact with water. River water, perhaps. I reached for the folder without asking permission. Inside lay a single small page, folded twice. Its edges were faintly rippled, as though dried hurriedly. When I unfolded it, I saw the handwriting of the young woman, delicate but firm. A note. Not a confession, a statement of intent. She had discovered the tutor's plagiarism from years earlier, concealed within papers long thought forgotten. She had intended to confront her. The locket had been her insurance proof hidden in plain sight. The tutor stepped forward with a soft exhalation, as though the act of seeing the page stripped her of the last remains of her composure. She said the confrontation had taken place at the river bend. She had tried to explain, to plead perhaps, but the student refused to bend. There had been a struggle of words first, then of movement. A raised hand, a startled recoil, a misjudged step, a reflexive strike, she whispered. Not meant to harm, only to silence. And then the girl had fallen quietly, almost gracefully, toward the bank where the reeds concealed the slope. A single moment of panic translated into permanence. Lewis asked why she had not sought help. Her answer was hardly more than a breath she had believed the girl was unconscious, not dying. She said she had panicked, taken the locket, torn out the note, and fled. People think murder is always the culmination of hatred or malice. But standing there, listening to her voice fracturing under the weight of truth, I felt only the bleak recognition that sometimes murder is simply the tragic conclusion of fear meeting opportunity. I asked where she had hidden the note. She looked at the folder, then at the window, then at me. Her voice broke as she admitted she had been unable to destroy it. A scholar, even a dishonest one, cannot bring herself to burn what is written. Words are too much like remnants of the self. As we walked her through the cloister toward the waiting car, the bells from a nearby chapel tolled with a softness that felt almost cruel. She moved slowly, as though every step were a confession. Lewis remained silent, his usual certainty replaced by something quieter, more troubled. I felt no triumph, only the weary understanding that the quietest murders are those committed not with intent, but with a single, irreversible miscalculation. When the car door closed behind her, the quadrangle returned to its stillness. And I found myself thinking, not for the first time, how fragile the boundary is between a life that continues and a life that abruptly stops quietly, without warning, beside a river that carries secrets away as gently as fallen leaves. There are endings that arrive with ceremony, and endings that slip quietly into the fabric of one's life, indistinguishable at first from the ordinary hush of a winter afternoon. The conclusion of the case fell into the latter category. No dramatic confession, no triumphant sense of having restored order, only the muted sound of a door closing as the tutor was taken away, her footsteps absorbed by the wet stones of the quad. Lewis watched her go with a heaviness he did not try to hide. I envied him for the simplicity of such emotion. My own thoughts drifted elsewhere, to the river bend, to the manuscript, to the locket whose fractured glass now lay on my desk like a small emblem of something I wasn't ready to name. That morning, I found myself drawn back to University Parks, though I told no one. The winter light was thin and chastened, filtering through bare branches, with the delicacy of something uncertain of its right to be there. The bench where the jogger had found the locket was empty, save for a small scatter of leaves that had gathered in its corner, as if sheltering from the breeze. I sat for a moment, letting the quiet settle around me. There is a kind of silence nature keeps for itself, a silence that requires no interpretation. It was in that silence that I tried to place the final line of houseman which had eluded me through the case. I had been carrying the incomplete fragment like an old injury, waiting for the mind to resolve what the heart already understood. Lewis had told me earlier that the college planned to host a memorial for the young woman. A modest gathering, he said, with readings from her work. I nodded, though I felt a strange reluctance at the idea of strangers mining her words for meaning she had not intended. The dead are too often spoken for by those who never knew them in life. Her manuscript, even in its fractured state, revealed a mind seeking clarity, a mind undone not by its own ambition, but by the frailties of those around her. I walked along the path toward the river, the earth soft beneath my shoes. The reeds had begun to stiffen with the cold, their movements slower, less urgent. I stood at the bend where she had met her, and accidentally, tragically, quietly. The current was low, reflecting the pale sky in wavering lines. I found myself rehearsing the tutor's words again, a reflexive strike, a moment's panic, a hurried departure. It was not innocence, but neither was it the monstrous cruelty we sometimes expect in such cases. Most harm is done by the ordinary, not the monstrous. A dog walker approached, nodding politely. He mentioned that the river looked peaceful today. I murmured something in reply. Peaceful, yes, but peace can be deceptive. The river had carried away the truth just long enough for the human mind to muddy it further. It was only the smallest details, the missing page, the misquoted line, the bruise behind the ear that had guided the case toward its inevitable end. Small things reveal large truths. I had built a career on that principle, though the weight of such truths felt heavier with each passing year. On my way back toward the park gate, I paused beside a low stone wall. The winter sun caught the frost there, scattering faint prisms of light across its surface. And it was then, without warning, that the missing line finally surfaced in my memory, the line I had reached for in the fog, the library, the interview rooms, each time slipping just beyond reach. I whispered it aloud, feeling the cadence settle with an odd finality. It was not revelation, only recognition, like greeting an old companion one had forgotten to miss. Lewis called as I walked back toward the high street. He asked whether I wanted to join him for a late lunch. I told him perhaps another day. He didn't press. He has learned that certain endings require solitude, even when they offer nothing to mourn. The case was solved, the culprit known, the narrative tidied. But tidy stories rarely leave anything of value behind. It is the untidiness that lingers. As I stepped into the quiet of my flat, I placed the broken locket on the windowsill where the winter light touched it gently. The glass, though cracked, still held a faint shimmer. And I thought of the girl whose life had intersected briefly with mine, leaving behind no epilogue except a line of poetry restored to its proper place at last. The world outside dimmed, and the room grew still. Some truths, I realized, are not meant to be resolved, only remembered.